Good morning, everybody. It's great to see you this morning. Thanks for being out on this beautiful Lord's Day morning as we join together for a time of Bible study. We're wrapping up a study of the parables that are included in Luke's gospel. Interestingly, Luke has a number of parables in his gospel that are not found in Matthew, Mark, or John. And so it's kind of a unique study in that sense that we're looking at these particular parables in Luke. We're wrapping up. If you're looking at your study guide, we're on lesson 11, but you don't need that. You'll be able to easily follow along with us. We're going to look at two parables that are found in Luke 18, Luke chapter 18. So open your Bibles there, and there's actually two parables in the first part of this chapter. We'll take them independently, separately, and see what we can learn from them. Just to give you a heads up in case I forget to mention it at the end of class, beginning next Sunday morning, what we intend to do, Lord willing, is begin a study of the churches that resulted from Paul's preaching and teaching work, his missionary journeys and so forth. So we'll be looking sort of at Paul's work, but in particular looking at the churches that resulted from the work that Paul did. And there's a study guide on the table in the back. Pick one of those up so that you can be prepared for our class next week. All right, so in Luke chapter 18, let's read the first parable beginning at verse 1. This one is really, I think, interesting because there's no doubt. He leaves no doubt at all. Jesus doesn't leave us in the dark concerning why he's teaching this parable. Luke's account starts out, he spake a parable unto them to this end. Now, here's your purpose, that men ought always to pray and not to faint, saying, there was in a city a judge which feared not God, neither regarded man. And there was a widow in that city, and she came unto him, saying, avenge me of mine adversary. And he would not for a while, but afterward he said within himself, though I fear not God nor regard man, yet because this widow troubleth me, I will avenge her, lest by her continual coming she weary me. And the Lord said, hear what the unjust judge saith. And shall not God avenge his own elect, which cry day and night unto him, though he bear long with them? I tell you that he will avenge them speedily. Nevertheless, when the Son of Man cometh, shall he find faith on the earth. All right, so again, the purpose of this parable is plainly stated in the introduction to it as Luke introduces. Jesus is going to tell this parable. He, Jesus, spake a parable unto them to this end, or for this purpose, that men ought always to pray and not to faint. Now, if we were to just stop there and not even consider the parable, the point is a worthy point. And sometimes we make that point even without referring to this parable. We say, prayer is a powerful tool. Prayer is an important thing. We ought to be a people of prayer. We ought to pray consistently, regularly, continually. We ought to be praying. We often reference 1 Thessalonians 5:17, pray without ceasing. That's kind of an interesting expression, pray without ceasing, and somebody might try to take it literally. I got to pray nonstop 24/7, which of course would be an impossibility. But I think the statement there by Paul in 1 Thessalonians 5:17 is just, don't ever quit praying. Don't ever give up on the notion of prayer. Be a person of prayer. Pray consistently always. Don't go long periods of time without praying. I think this can be sort of a challenge to us in our busy world today. We get so wrapped up in the affairs of daily living. We got a lot of things to do, a lot of things to pay attention to. And it's possible to let all of that sort of push prayer sort of at least to the back burner, if not completely off the stovetop. We don't make time for prayer. I confess to you that this happens to me, and I'll be going along, maybe well into my daily routine. I think, oh, wait a minute, I haven't prayed yet. I need to pray. I need to begin the day with prayer, and I try to do that. But I confess to you, there's times when I get so busy that I may start into my routine without even starting with an initial prayer for the day. So, this is a worthy point that needs to be emphasized. We need to be people of prayer. Tom?
I also think the parables, as we'll see as we get into it, is one that shows the persistent prayer for a particular purpose.
Yeah.
If you look at the widow, what was her problem? What did she want accomplished? And she continued asking for it, but it wasn't supposed to be provided.
So we'll get to that. We'll get to that specific problem she had, but let's apply your point in general. So her problem, she had a specific problem that she was wanting addressed. Well, we may have a problem that's not the same as hers. Maybe mine is a health problem, or a financial problem, or a family relationship problem, or who knows. But that happens, right? In our lives, different specific problems come up. And we should be persistent in prayer. What is your specific problem? Whatever that specific problem may be, we need to be persistent in addressing that. Paul?
On the most basic level, what counts as a prayer? I sometimes struggle with have I said a legitimate prayer, or have I just said something so lightly thought of it doesn't count as a prayer? For example, I'm driving down the road, somebody cuts me off, I avoid an accident. Thank you. I avoid that accident in a prayerful way.
Yeah.
Prayer, or is that just kind of
I don't know.
or
That's,
do you have to, the Catholic in me, the way I was raised, feels like I should install a communion platform in my home and have little red candles with an incense burning for that to count as a prayer.
yeah, no.
That's the extreme on one end and the extreme on the other. Where do you say this is the line, this counts as prayer, and that?
Well, I think in the most general response that I could make to your question is, if the thought is directed toward God. In other words, if you're saying to God, "Thank you for keeping me safe on the road," basically, that I would say that counts as prayer. I've always taken a lot of consolation in Nehemiah. Nehemiah was cupbearer to the king, and you're supposed to be at your best behavior when you go before the king. And you're not supposed to look sad or depressed. You go to the king with a big smile on your face, you're serving the king. And so Nehemiah went before the king, but he was depressed over what he had heard about his people and the conditions of Jerusalem back home. And he went before the king. The king could tell he wasn't his normal self. And he asked him, "What's wrong, Nehemiah? What's wrong?" And he took a minute. It says he said a prayer, and then he responded to the king. How long could that prayer have been? It couldn't have been very long. It had to just be, real quick in his mind to say a prayer. So prayers don't have to be long. I think some prayers should be long. I think we should practice that prayer to be able to say long prayers, because there's a lot to pray about, but not every prayer has to be a long prayer. Wade?
So in my mind, prayer is any communication that I have with God. From me to Him. If it's a communication, a request, a thanksgiving, anything, in my mind, that's a prayer.
Yeah. I think it needs to be, in other words, I'm thankful a lot, but I think it needs to be an expressed gratitude. In other words, I don't think it's, God knows I'm thankful. I'm driving down the road and it's a pretty day and I'm thankful for a pretty day. God knows that. I don't think that's prayer. Just the fact that I feel thankful. I need to express thankfulness. So I think it's a step above just being thankful. It's actually, yeah. Dawn.
Prayer is your personal relationship with God.
Yeah, and I think you're right. And as Wade was saying, it's the way we communicate with God. And so it's important, extremely important. One of the, James chapter 5, we often talk about, probably don't need to spend all of our time in generalities about prayer. We'll get to the parable here in a minute. But in James chapter 5, we often make reference to verse 16, "The effectual fervent prayer of a righteous man availeth much." It works. Prayer is a powerful tool. We need to use it. But the other thing, and I don't the world in general does not realize this, but the other thing is that we're the only people who really have this privilege. The faithful children of God are the only ones who have this available. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 12, 1 Peter 2:12 says, the eyes of the Lord are over the righteous, and his ears are open to their prayers, but the face of the Lord is against them that do evil. And so this is a unique privilege that we have. Stop thinking about that. What if you had... So let's say that President Trump gave out his personal cell phone number to 20 people, and you're one of the 20. Would you feel privileged about that? Oh, man. I mean, I'd feel pretty special about that. President Trump gave me his personal cell phone number. I can call him whenever I want. You don't have that. I have that. I have that privilege. We'd feel very special about that. Well, this is even more than that, right? God actually requests us to come before his throne in prayer. And we are an exclusive group of people who have that privilege. We should definitely want to use it. Okay, all right. So, again, the purpose of this parable in Luke chapter 18 is well stated. Be persistent in prayer. Pray. Never faint or never give up. Never quit. This parable is such an easy word picture, isn't it? It is very, very easy to visualize this in your mind's eye. So here's this judge. He's a bad guy. He's a very bad actor. He's an unjust judge, and that's the way that we often refer to this the parable of the persistent widow or the unjust judge. He did not fear God. He was not a God-fearing man, and he was not fair and just to people. He was a judge, and he had a position, but he was a bad, corrupt person. So this widow comes before him, and she says, "Avenge me of mine adversary." So Tom mentioned earlier, she had a specific case that she wanted dealt with when she came before the judge. She was dealing with some adversary, something. Now remember, this is a parable. This is a story. And so, we don't want to make too much out of a detail in the parable that the Lord is not expanding upon. We don't know what that adversary had done to her. We don't know what her specific grievance was, but it was a specific case. Avenge me of my adversary. She had someone who had done her wrong in some way, and we have no idea what that might have been. And of course, it's a story. It's not an actual historical event. This is a story that, this is a story that Jesus is telling. But this was her grievance. Avenge me of mine adversary. I like the point that Tom was making earlier. This is directing us to pray about specific things, and I do think that that's a good principle of prayer. Be specific. Talk to the Lord about details. Tell him the specifics of things that you're dealing with. We ought to do that. Caleb, did you have I thought you were about ready to tell us something. And he wasn't going to do it. He's an unjust judge. He's an unfair guy. He doesn't care to do the right thing. If he was a judge who cared to do the right thing, he would have addressed this problem immediately. The first time the widow came to him, he would have taken care of it if he was a right guy. He's not a right guy. And it says in verse 4, he would not for a while. And so she had been dealing with this judge. We could make the point, it's not a point of this parable, the point of it, we're not privileged to avenge our enemies. Vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord. So it's not our place to take personal vengeance, but God has set up a system whereby vengeance can be sought. Romans 13 tells us that civil government is his agent to enact vengeance upon those who have done evil. So right at the end of chapter 12 in Romans, vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord. And then it immediately goes to a discussion of civil government being God's minister for vengeance. And so this is one of the ways that I can't go out and take revenge or vengeance on my own, but I should have an expectation that civil government ministers would address a situation. And that's what she's doing here. So she's following the pattern that's set forth in the Word of God. She's going to the judge. She's not avenging herself. She's expecting that the judge would avenge her. And he's not, because he's a bad guy. He's just a bad guy. Easy to picture in our mind. But here's the point. He said within himself. So he's talking to himself in his mind, in the story that Jesus is constructing for us. In the mind of this unjust judge, he doesn't care to do this for her because it's right. And he admits, it's interesting that Jesus has him saying to himself, I don't fear God or man. But this widow keeps troubling me. She just keeps hounding me. She just keeps coming back, and she asks and she asks and she asks. And she's just wearing me out. She's wearing me out with all this. I'm going to do what she wants just to get her off my back. I'm going to do this just so I don't have to keep hearing from her. And so the persistent widow, sometimes the word importunity is used, and sometimes this widow is called the importunate widow. She was just persistent. She wouldn't give up. She kept coming and making her request. And so the unjust judge gave her what she wanted, addressed her problem, and gave her relief, not because he would do it out of fairness and justice, but just because she was so persistent in asking for it. Okay, so here's the point, Jesus says, verse 6, hear what the unjust judge says. Shall not God avenge his own elect, which cry to him night and day, though he bear long with them? I tell you, he will avenge them speedily. So when it comes to a matter of vengeance, making right wrongs that have been committed against you, the Lord knows that. And if an unjust judge would address a problem because he was being just continually asked about it, and he's an unjust judge, he's a bad person, how much more will a loving God address the needs of his children? And again, the specific issue here is to avenge wrongs that have been committed against you. Again, we made the point, we can't seek personal vengeance, but God has promised, vengeance is mine. I will repay, he says. So, in regards to things like that, where we have been personally wronged in one, you could list just an unlimited number of ways that we might be wronged. I think a lot of times when we think about being wronged, we think about somebody maybe cheating us out of money. That's a wrong for sure, but that's not the only way that you can be wronged a lot of ways. But however it is that you've been wronged, you can't seek personal vengeance, but you can pray to God about it, and God will answer those prayers. God will answer. God wants to answer. The unjust judge doesn't want to answer, but he did because he just kept being asked about it. How much more would a loving God care for his children and answer the prayers that they pray? So again, this was addressing a wrong committed against the woman. And so that would be a specific application of this parable. When you've been wronged in any of the infinite number of ways that you might be wronged by someone, pray to God about that with the absolute confidence that God hears and wants to answer your prayers. Now, I think you can expand that concept to all matters. The matter of this parable was a wrong committed and prayers for to be avenged of a wrong committed. God answers those kind of prayers. This parable says so. The scriptures say so. But I think you can expand that concept of God hearing and answering the prayers and needs of his children. It's just a truth. It is the truth. Eric?
So in the parable, the vengeance takes place in this earthly world. Is it reading too much into it to assume we pray for justice or whatever is going to take place in this life?
Expand on that question just a little bit for me.
Well, I've always heard and taught or understood, I guess, that ultimately God's wrath, or vengeance is going to ultimately happen, and then it may not happen in this life.
Yeah, that's true.
But in this parable, it happens presently.
Yeah, that's right.
So if you read too much into it, to think that may be the same case, that the application is supposed to be for us.
Some things. So again, Romans 13 says, so somebody stole your car. You know who stole your car. You know where your car is over there locked up in his backyard. And you might say, I'm going to take my gun over there and I'm going to shoot that. If he doesn't give me my car back, I'm going to shoot him right on the spot. Or maybe I won't take my gun. Maybe I'll just go over there and beat him to a bloody pulp with my fists. He's going to give me my car back one way or the other. No. That's not your job. That's not your business. But you have a reasonable expectations from Romans chapter 13 that you could go to the authorities and say, this man stole my car. He lives right there and my car is in his backyard. Will you please go address this situation? Arrest that guy for auto theft and give me my car back. And they would, right? They would. And so you would be avenged. And so what I'm saying is, in some instances, you may be avenged in the present world, in this present time. But you could imagine another scenario where somebody has hurt you in some non-physical way. Maybe someone has caused you tremendous grief and heartache. And you pray to God about that. And you may not recognize his vengeance until eternity, when that person who hasn't repented of their wrong ends up being lost eternally because they wronged you and never repented of it. So I would say, in answer to your question, I think both. Some forms of God's vengeance might be in this present world, and others we may have to wait for eternity before it happens. But he said, I think there in Romans chapter 12, at verse 19, the last phrase of Romans 12:19, vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord. He doesn't say, vengeance is mine and maybe no, he says, I will repay. So when we've been wrong, we have a confidence and a promise from God. But again, some of it may be immediate in this world, some of it may be in eternity. Thoughts, Tom?
We sort of see that principle a lot with the children of Israel. Initially, we look at their enslavement in, Egypt. They continued to ask to be delivered from that. And then Moses was presented to them and he delivered about. The judges is basically just time after time after time. People oppressed ask for a deliverer. God provides a deliverer, delivers. Book of Revelation basically is that answer. It says, they ask how long, and he says, continue to the end, and they're looking for it. He actually spells out some of the means by which he's going to avenge them in that aspect. And the concept there is, God wins. Have that concept that God is going to take care of it.
Yeah, that's right. That's a good, I've always thought that's a good two-word summary of the book of Revelation. God wins. God wins. Caleb?
I think there's some interesting ideas here when you look at some translational differences as well as how the parable itself is fundamentally presented. The King James says, avenge me of mine adversary, it's a request. The ESV and the LSB she's saying, give me justice against my adversary. And then the New American Standard, very choppy and literal, says, give me legal protection from my opponent. So I think there's two important ideas here. One of them being, this isn't a situation where the victim can go take a gun, so to speak, where the car's been stolen and go. I think it's presented as a widow, as she both, probably not herself, but also in a societal standpoint, cannot go get justice for herself. That's why she's approaching the judge, is because she can't go get justice for herself. But then on top of that, The thing we've all been talking about is that she is the oppressed. So she is the oppressed, but she also cannot go get justice for herself, and so she goes to the judge.
Yeah.
And that's a much bigger. That's the much bigger gospel approach that we ourselves take. Is we stand before the judge, and we also have been hearing from the accuser the whole time. That's part of how Satan is presented in Revelation, is as the accuser. He's the one who accuses. He's the one who says, no, she, the widow, she's the problem. She's guilty. And our request is that no, justice be made right, things be done right. And ultimately, thankfully, we don't have to pester an unrighteous judge. We tarry with and plead with a righteous judge, but not just a righteous judge, but someone who stands in our place and takes the blame.
Right. I think you're exactly right. If you were to boil this parable down, again, I think this is an easy parable. This is one of the easy ones, very easy to visualize. The point of this parable is, if an unjust judge would ultimately respond because he was being continually asked about it, and didn't, if an unjust judge would respond in that fashion, what do you think God will do if you keep coming before him with your prayers? If an unjust judge would answer because he was being repeatedly asked, how much more so would God respond to us if we continue in prayer and make our requests known to him? It's a wonderful thing. It's just a wonderful thing that we ought to be just so grateful for. Now, real quickly, we're going to run out of time. We're not careful here, but I want to ask you about the last phrase in verse 8. So the parable wraps up. The first phrase, I tell you, he, God, will avenge his people speedily. Nevertheless, when the Son of Man cometh, shall he find faith on the earth. Now, why did Jesus throw that in there? Why is that included at the end of this parable? How do you think that fits? Anybody want to tackle that? Tom?
I think that Jesus goes on to, here's this widow who's willing to do whatever to all the way to the end except to receive justice. And then Jesus is saying, well, I think the theory, the Lord's going to come quickly. So, in your aspect, when you're looking, for that eternal reward, are you going to be persistent in continuing follow through to the end? Or is when the Lord comes, it's because you gave up and he's not coming?
I think that's right. So in my notes I wrote, do you believe this? Do you believe that the Lord will avenge his people? Do you believe this? And will you act accordingly?
Yes.
I think that's sort of the way I would put that in my own words. I've just told you a parable, Jesus says, which promises that God will respond to the needs of his people. Do you believe it? And will you therefore be consistent and continual in prayer and service? Okay, real quickly, let's take this other parable. This is another really well-known parable. Verse 9. I'm in Luke 18 at verse 9. He spake this parable unto certain which trusted in themselves that they were righteous and despised others. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, the one a Pharisee and the other a publican. The Pharisee stood and prayed thus with himself, God, I thank thee that I am not as other men are, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even as this publican. I fast twice in a week, I give tithes of all that I possess. And the publican, standing afar off, would not lift up so much as his eyes unto heaven, but smote upon his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. For every one that exalteth himself shall be abased, and he that humbleth himself shall be exalted. All right, so in this instance, some of the parables that we have studied, Jesus was obviously trying to make a point to the Pharisees. Although he may not have named them specifically, he was making a point about them. In this case, he doesn't leave that to be understood. He states it. He doesn't leave it to be. He doesn't leave it as an implication that you should draw. he states it that he's talking about someone like a Pharisee. This was a Pharisee. A Pharisee and a publican went up to the temple to pray. We know both cases. And for sake of time, we won't go into great detail about the Pharisees and the kind of people they were. We've talked a lot about that. And of course, we understand about the publicans too, who were greatly despised. So often in the parables, Jesus purposefully chooses extremes to emphasize the point he wants to make. And so in this case, he has, in this word picture he's going to draw for us, he has chosen extreme. The Pharisees, the author of our studies asked us, what words would you use to describe a Pharisee? Well, words like proud, self-righteous, arrogant, boastful. And then, but the publicans were, as we know, much despised. They were Jews, but they were much despised by their fellow Jews because they were tax collectors for the Romans. And the Jews didn't like the Roman occupation. They didn't like their requirement to be submissive to the Romans. They certainly didn't like the idea of paying taxes to the Romans. These publicans were Jews who were serving the Romans and collecting taxes for them. And typically, the publicans themselves were very corrupt. And they lined their own pockets in the tax collections that they did. And we've talked about how they did that in the past. And so Jesus has chosen two people that will really highlight the point that he's trying to make here. It has been so often pointed out that when the Pharisee prayed, he actually didn't ask for anything. As you read the words, as Jesus constructed, again, Jesus, the master teacher, what a wonderful construction of the story this is. The Pharisee stood, again, I've cautioned us all through this study, don't try to make a point that Jesus wasn't trying to make, in a parable. That, you can get too far into it, and maybe Jesus that wasn't even a point. That was just a detail that wasn't intended to make a point. It is interesting, though, in the King James, the way King James says, the Pharisee stood and prayed thus with himself. He's basically talking to himself here because God's not here. This isn't anything that's going to make a point with God. He stood and prayed thus with himself. I thank thee, I'm not as other men are, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even as this publican. In other words, I'm a good guy. I'm a righteous man. I'm self-righteous. I fast twice in the week. I give tithes of all that I possess. Well, actually, if you were to go back to the old law, which these men obviously would have been living under, there's more requirement than that, right? There's more requirements than fasting and paying tithes. So would you make a point of the fact that he's pretty proud of himself without indication that he had actually even made effort to keep all the law? I don't know. I don't think that's the point Jesus is trying to drive home here. Clearly the point Jesus is trying to drive home with this Pharisee is he was very well pleased with himself, and he actually didn't think he needed anything. The reason why he didn't ask God for anything is very likely, like Pharisees were, they believed themselves to be perfect law keepers, and that he didn't need anything from God. I'm doing fine. I'm just reporting in to let you know the good things I'm doing. That's sort of the way this prayer comes across. So he had that approach. One of the points we could make, just a point about prayer, is when we pray to God, we should pray with the understanding He already knows. There's no need to catalog your good deeds before God. There's really no purpose in that. And I don't. You can give me your thoughts if you think otherwise. There's just, we can talk to God about things that we are doing and ask for His help with the things that we are doing. Caleb's going off to Alaska to preach. Very appropriate for Caleb to preach. Go with us to Alaska. Help us in the work that we're doing there. which would be different than, God, look at me. I'm going to Alaska. And I think you should be very pleased with me that I'm undertaking this. See, there's a different attitude in prayer. And so I'm saying we don't need to pray to God to brag about what we can pray to Him and ask Him to help us with what we're trying to do in His service, which is different than bragging about what we are doing in His service. None of us have, a reason to brag. I think it's interesting that it was just the very previous chapter here, Luke 17:10. So likewise, ye, when ye have done all those things which are commanded you, say, we are unprofitable servants. We have done that which was our duty to do. You don't have anything to brag about. Nobody has anything to brag about. And actually, you don't need to, because God already knows what you're doing. And if you're doing good things in His cause, He's pleased with you. Caleb.
I'll do my best to say this quickly, but I briefly mentioned this in a lesson I presented this last Sunday night when having some thoughts about prayer. But I think that it's important to recognize that there's a difference between praise and thanksgiving in our prayers. I've been to so many boys' camps where these boys are assigned, okay, pray, prayers, praise, and unintentionally they always turn it into, instead of, God, I praise you for blank, I praise you for blank, they turn it into, God, I thank you, which is a very subtle shift. And I don't necessarily think it's a problem, but I think it's something we need to think about, because if we follow praise and thanksgiving to their, let's just say, unbalanced logical conclusions, we follow those all the way out to one while totally neglecting the other. If we follow thanksgiving out while neglecting praise, then we unintentionally make it all about ourselves, which sounds counterintuitive. But when our prayers only consist of thanksgiving, we find a way to always relate things back to ourselves. It's always how what God has done relates to us. Versus praise is more of just a proclamation and acknowledgement of who God is. But if we just have praise without any thanksgiving, then we lose the relationship of what our relationship is with God. So we have to have both praise and thanksgiving. Yeah. And I think that praise element is a flavor of our prayers that at least I have found lacking, and I have noticed lacking in
I don't think I've made that point too, that I don't think we're very skilled at praise. That's I've always appreciated reading in the Psalms for that reason. The Psalms, if you study that, to kind of observe how the psalmists in the various Psalms extend praise to God, then there's a lesson. How do you praise God? I don't think we're real good at that. That's a good point. Real quickly, the publican, the tax collector, he is the diametric opposite of the Pharisee. He wouldn't lift up so much as his eyes to heaven, smote upon his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. So he's acknowledging his sinful condition and praying for mercy. I've wondered, again, this is not a point of the parable, but did you notice that he would not lift up so much as his eyes to heaven? Why is it that we bow our heads when we pray? I wondered if some of it might be based upon that expression from Jesus. Certainly it is an indication, and I don't believe you have to bow your head when you pray. I'm not saying that there's any mandated physical posture in prayer. I remember a poem years ago, I've lost it. I used to have a copy of it somewhere, but it was addressing this idea of the posture of prayer. And this guy in the poem had fallen headlong into a well. And he said, the prayingest prayer I ever prayed, I prayed standing on my head. I don't think there's any mandated posture of prayer. But I think when we bow our head and close our eyes, it is a sort of a physical manifestation of humility. We're coming before the God of heaven, and we need to be humble. And this publican certainly represents that kind of humility. So he's begging for mercy, which we all need, right? And we define mercy as when we don't get what we deserve to get. So, as sinners before God, we deserve to be punished. In His great mercy, we often link His grace and mercy, but when just talking about mercy, in His great mercy, He does not give us what we deserve, and that's a good thing. That's a really good thing, and that's what this publican was praying for. God, be merciful to me, a sinner. You know, I don't know if you ever do this. If you just look for Bible phrases to include in your own prayers, there's a phrase that you could include in your own prayers. Just, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. And we would all do well to think that way. And the conclusion of this parable is unmissable. Cannot be missed, I guess. I don't know if that's unmissable. It cannot be missed. Verse 14, this man, the publican, the tax collector, went down to his house justified rather than the other. So 2 men prayed, and there were 2 outcomes. The publican, who acknowledged his need for God's mercy and admitted his sinful conduct, he received mercy. He received what he asked for. He went to his house justified rather than the Pharisee. He says, for one that exalts himself like that Pharisee will be abased, and he that humbleth himself like the publican will be exalted. You just can't miss that conclusion. So again, it's interesting that both of these parables have to do with prayer, right? And there's some lessons about prayer in both of these. In this one, if you were just looking for maybe some observations about prayer, this tells us about the humility that we need when we go before God in prayer, and the fact that we need to acknowledge our need for His mercy and forgiveness. Tom, did you have a thought?
Just we're looking at sort of a public situation. They both went up to the temple to pray. They were there. The one went and sort of secretly and to himself to knock. The other one basically looked around. Oh, who's here? Says, well, I'm not like this guy, or even this publican. He looked and noticed the publican and picked him out. And it just sort of shows that contrast there. So even in public prayer, a lot of times, there are places that we go that we in public prayer. We should be concerned about seeing who sees us pray or hears us pray. That we're there, we acknowledge God wherever.
I think it's a fair point. I would expand upon it just a little bit. This would encourage all of us when we lead publicly in prayer. Remember, because sometimes I wonder when I hear a prayer, is this guy trying to make a point to us, or is he talking to God? So prayer is not the time for me. So if I'm assigned to make a prayer, to lead in a public prayer, this is not my role here in leading in prayer is not to instruct you all. It's to address God in prayer. And sometimes I wonder if that line gets crossed, where sometimes there's an intention to inform the congregation rather than to communicate with God. I just think that's maybe an interesting point. Eric?
I think maybe instruction could be a byproduct,
Oh, yeah, definitely. It could be a byproduct. Yeah. But just some interesting things to think about. We're out of time. Dawn?
No Christian would be anything without the death of Christ, and that's enough in itself should be humble.
Absolutely right. Okay, so interesting. I hope you enjoyed, as I did, studying these parables that are found in the Gospel of Luke. Next week, Lord willing, we'll start a study of the churches that resulted from Paul's preaching and teaching work. And there's a study guide on the back to help you get ready for that study. Thanks, everybody.